Um, Welcome to the ZWAC Show. This month, we're going to give you the fourth and final chapter of what happened to the bottle bills in the 2021 California legislative season. And I'm going to treat this a little like Game of Thrones and treat you first to a recap before I introduce our speaker. The ZWAC and NCRA started out by posing the question in a debate of whether we ought to completely scrap California's bottle bill or try to fix it. And there was at least one scrap alternative on the table because there was a Senate bill that would have instituted an EPR system, which essentially is scrapping the existing system. But after a lengthy discussion with a lot of people that are on the call right now, there was a consensus that we shouldn't try to scrap the thing, that for all of its problems, for all of the things that it doesn't do well, overall, it does a lot of good. It recovers a lot of resources. So maybe better to fix it than scrap it. Although there was a little bit of undercurrent of dissent from folks who thought it's just not possible to fix it. Better just to scrap it and try something new. So that's how we left episode 1. Episode 2 was, having decided that we ought to try to fix it, was a discussion about, well, what should we fix? And the unanimous consensus at the end of the second episode was, we need to get more money to the recycling centers. The third chapter was, well, how are we going to do that? And during the third episode, we found out that, well, NCRA doesn't really have the resources to lead the fight. And oh, by the way, getting money to the recycling centers is not crystal clear because some recycling centers need it more than others, and you need to discern which ones need it most. So now the legislative session is closed. There are no more bills. Whatever is passed through the legislature is going to go to the governor, who will sign it or he won't. I think he's probably still the governor after today. The bills that didn't get through, they live to fight another day or not. But we're at the end of the line. And so in an episode since in Game of Thrones, we're imagining, Daenerys flying on top of a dragon over King's Landing. And the first question I'm going to ask Jeff Donlevy is, who got incinerated? So Jeff is here. He works for a recycling company called Ming's Recycling that operate recycling centers. He's also on the Statewide Recycling Commission, which has a longer name that I can't recite. But he's participated in all 4 episodes of this story. And he's here to talk about what happened. So starting out, Jeff, who got incinerated this year? What stakeholder group didn't do well?
I think the stakeholder group that did not do well were the consumers, because there's no stimulus to open up new redemption centers in the underserved areas. Recycling centers that are in the higher cost areas are going to continue to struggle. So I think consumers, they got the short end of the stick again. And then recycling centers in the underserved areas, I think they're going to continue to struggle. I say that lightly right now because we are seeing record scrap prices for aluminum and plastic. So I think they're doing okay. We are seeing a few people with some interest in opening in underserved areas, but I think that's indicative of the scrap prices. But when scrap prices go up, Cal Recycle usually has a formula that lowers the subsidies for plastic. So they'll end up taking that away at some point.
So in your work with Ming's Recycling, you try to follow these different legislative efforts that have been going on for several months. I know from experience when I try to follow these things that as it approaches the deadline, things change in lightning speed, and they change in ways that aren't obvious. So it requires a lot of work to figure out, what are they doing? What are they changing? And as a company that's not the size of Waste Management or Recology, how do you keep up with all these lightning changes, or can you even keep up?
It's very difficult to keep up unless you have a good lobbyist. For the recycling industry in general, they're not very well organized. We're one of the few companies that have a lobbyist, but the big downfall or the weakness for Mings and the CRV recyclers is we don't have anything else to give. When they're talking about other legislation, we can't give or take and support other legislation, such as the haulers. They're heavy into labor, and they're also involved with the building trades. So they can talk about building and hauling, labor, the number of employees that they have combined. They're a stakeholder in any healthcare discussions. Recycling centers, we're just not involved in any of the other discussions. We're just a little one-trick pony, as it would be.
So
Is that because you're kind of automated compared to hauling?
No, it's just a very decentralized industry. A
Okay.
lot of mom and pop operators. If somebody has 3 recycling centers, they're considered a large operator. If they have 10, they're a big operator. But for the most part of the 1,220 recycling centers, I would say 80% of those are single owner operators.
to what extent are they unionized?
Very little. I don't know of any recycling centers represented by labor unless they are operated by a waste hauling company that is represented by a collective bargaining agreement.
So what I'm hearing then is if as consumers, we want to actually get some of our nickels back, or if we're a recycling center in an underserved area that would like to get some of the money that the legislature promised to it, it sounds like we need to have more to trade favors with. How do we do that?
That I don't know. I mean, it's a squeaky wheel. I made calls and talked to some of the Republican representatives up in Northern California, and they said that calls to their office on the bottle bill is one of their #1 complaints. Where can I recycle in Susanville? Where can I recycle in Modoc County? You know, they get the calls to those offices, whether it's Assembly or Senate. They just don't have answers for them.
So they just tally up the calls and don't do anything?
They haven't.
What could change that?
I think the bottom line is it's going to have to come from the administration. They're going to have to state what they want to see to fix this program. We've been around for over 30 years. The legislation has had over 70 revisions to the legislation, and it seems that it's only gotten worse in some parts of the state. I'll say that there's 40 counties that have over 10 million residents, and there's about 150 recycling centers in those 40 counties. There's some areas that the bottle bill works fairly well. Kern County, Tulare County, LA County, parts of Riverside and San Bernardino County, because land, labor, and access to the markets is fairly cheap. But then in those counties, there's some rumors and some allegations that fraud is an active part of the program. And that comes down to lack of enforcement from CalRecycle.
So I'm going to come back and ask you about what you think comes next, but to close out this season, we had SB 38, which was an EPR bill. We had AB 1454, which had a lot of different things in it, including some money for redemption centers. What happened to the 2 of them?
Well, there was a few other bills. Assembly Bill 962 is going to allow refillables into the program to be eligible for processing payments, where if you want to wash and reuse a bottle, you can. Right now, the requirement is they would have to crush the bottle, and that doesn't work for refillable. And then Assembly Bill 1311 is going to allow for alternate hours and allow for bag drop programs. So I think the Assembly is going to be able to say that they did pass legislation to help the bottle bill, Those two pieces are very, very small. They won't help open up new recycling centers or help those that are struggling. But they'll be able to say that they passed two pieces of legislation again, but really not going to help the consumers. There's Assembly Bill 478, which was a post-consumer content legislation for thermoforms. And that tried to change the definition of commingled and the commingled rate. That would have been very difficult for the haulers. And they opposed that, and that one got shot down. As far as SB 38 and Assembly Bill 1454, SB 38 was a big change. It would have taken the bottle bill out of the control of Cal Recycle and the legislature, turned it over to a third-party organization. You could call it an extended producer responsibility organization. You could call it a system operator. And they would have had control of the program to make changes. It would have been much different. A lot of people said it would have been similar to the Oregon program. But unfortunately, SB 38 did not have the clarity that would have given more people comfort with it. It just said, we're going to do something completely different than we've done. The Senate passed it with a 23 vote support. When it went on to the Assembly, it did not get out of committee because it was so different than Assembly Bill 1454. Assembly 1454 had a lot of amendments, or excuse me, it passed the Assembly with 69-0 vote. And then before it went to the Senate committee, I think it had 15 or 20 amendments. So it changed. I think the Senate committee said, what are you doing? And they came back after the summer recess with even more amendments. It had probably 20 changes to the program. It looked like it was going to do a lot, but I think it would have actually done very little. It said that it was going to help open up recycling centers by providing forgivable loans, but the amount was just far too low. It was going to provide money to every recycling center, regardless of size, but it would have provided more money to Kern County than to San Francisco County, even though the populations are the same. So it looked like it was going to do a lot, but it actually would have done very little. And I think the number of amendments that went through, I think that was the result of that not getting out of the Senate committee, and both of those turned into 2-year bills.
So it sounds like too many complications is going to doom the thing. But this is a complicated system. So there was a certain sentiment to scrap the system in favor of something different, which SB 38 was. But obviously, when you're scrapping it and doing something different, you have to kind of set the parameters for what the different is going to look like. Because to me, I think, well, if the powerful stakeholders in Sacramento are the haulers, maybe the grocers, and they kind of like the system that's in place, even though it has problems, even though maybe the consumers don't get the nickels, how are they ever going to tolerate a switch to a system that they don't control? And if they control it, why would there be any change?
That's a great question. It's worked for quite a few people for quite a long time. I think the haulers seem to be pretty happy with it. They got another $10 million from the program for a quality incentive payment for plastic recycling. So it's going to take the plastic material that they have in the curbside programs that is not very good material, and it's going to give them an incentive to make it a little bit better.
Instead of just banning the stuff.
Correct. Instead of saying you should have been doing that all along.
Right.
they're going to give them a little carrot to try and get it better. But the long-term concern is, are they going to have that as a annual amount that they get to keep? Instead of saying, you should have had a quality standard all along. So the haulers have done pretty well with the program. The beverage manufacturers, they continue to do just fine with the program because there's a processing formula that determines what their contribution should be. And it's based on the operating cost of recycling centers. And I think it gets down to the root cause of the problem, that the subsidies that are paid to recycling centers is based off of a weighted average formula. And there's about 100 recycling centers that control about 70% of the volume. So those are your lowest cost operators that are in the, I'll say brick and mortar facilities. They're constantly going to pull the operating costs lower. And with Susan on the call, I think she should have coined the term the death spiral. It's going to keep pulling the subsidies down lower and lower because more volume is going to go through these high volume sites. And with a weighted average formula, if you took it out to infinity, the most economically viable solution is one recycling center, and all 40 million people take your containers to that one center. That's the most efficient operation.
So in a moment, I'm going to ask you how to fix all this. But before I get there, you also had something you were trying to do through the budget process, which I've never tried to understand. But through that process, you were trying to get some money for underserved recycling centers, Ming's among them. What happened with that?
Okay, I'll get to that. I want to back up. The grocers also did very well this cycle because in the governor's budget and through the budget process, they've awarded 5 additional pilot programs. So 5 jurisdictions can have pilot programs and they can get up to $1 million. But unfortunately, that will result in all the stores and the dealers in that jurisdiction being exempt from in-store take-back. So you could have, a county, let's call it Alameda, and I could create a pilot program with 3 locations, and it could exempt all the stores in Alameda County from in-store take-back or Contra Costa County. So the grocers will see a huge windfall in 5 jurisdictions, because if somebody starts a pilot program, it will create mass exemptions for the grocers. And those pilot programs are extended until June 2026. So I think those are going to be a delay for any reform, because people will say, let's see how the pilot programs work out. It's just a delay tactic, and the grocers and the dealers will see a big exemption.
So you're telling me the grocers did something clever and got something out of the legislature. The haulers got a bunch of money out of the legislature. The beverage people are already happy with the system. What did they do, and what did they have that we don't?
Well, I mean, you're talking billion-dollar industries. They're very active in all their communities, providing great service, providing jobs, tax revenue, a lot of things to help out. And then the lobbying groups and those companies are very active, helping out elected officials at all levels of government, whether it's city council, county supervisors, state or federal level. They're all very active in taking care of the elected leaders.
Was there any blowback at all to Recology for having defrauded its ratepayers in San Francisco and having public officials?
No, I mean, that wasn't even an issue.
Okay.
I think they were very quiet.
So essentially, they
What did Mike know, and when did he know it?
so
That's the question.
they have more money and resources and more clever people than we do.
So with
What
the
did Mike
budget,
know and when did he know it?
Okay, Arthur, thanks.
so with the budget
Okay,
trailer
shut up.
bill, with Senator Wachowski, I think when he realized that SB 38 was not going to get a floor vote in the assembly, there was some discussion about getting some money in the budget to start introducing technology, introducing RVMs, introducing bag drop programs, helping open recycling centers in the underserved areas, and then helping recycling centers with a supplemental processing payment. Back in February, the Statewide Commission sent a letter to the governor and the leadership in both the Assembly and Senate, asking for certain items. And Senator Wachowski, I think, with his budget trailer bill, addressed 4 of the 8 items. And one of the items was going to be $9.6 million to open 40 recycling centers in underserved areas. Then there was going to be $22 million to pay grocers for in-store take-back, install RVMs and bag drop systems. And then towards the very end, I think there was going to be $60 million in supplemental payments to all recycling centers that handle over 5 million containers a year. But unfortunately, that just didn't have any money for other stakeholders, whether it be the haulers, whether it be Conservation Corps, whether it be cities and counties. It was strictly focused on redemption opportunities. And if there's more redemption opportunities, more money comes out of the curbside containers. So the haulers would see less money. So that was a big concern. So it just didn't get the support in the Assembly. I think the Senate was going to support it. There were some staff people on the Senate side that were supportive. But ultimately, Assemblymember Bloom and then Assemblymember Ting from San Francisco said they did not want to hear it because it did provide major reform. So it basically died with 3 days left, even though it would have provided a greater opportunity for redemption centers opening up in some areas. And then people getting to see reverse vending machines in action, because I think there's a big appetite from grocers to have a hands-off approach that RVMs or bag drops could provide. And that trailer bill would have provided some startup money to get those systems running. But if those systems would have got up and running so people could see them going into next session in 2022, I think that would have led more of the discussion towards major overhaul that SB 38 might provide, rather than a lot of surgical fixes, a lot of surgical tweaks that Assembly Bill 1454 might have been attempting to do.
So this sounds like it must have been a frustrating last several months for you.
You know, it was very up and down. There were days that I didn't think it was going to happen. There were days that I thought there was high confidence that it was going to happen. There was some discussion from some staff people within the Capitol that were very, very positive, and then others were very cold to it. Up until the last week, I thought it was going to have a chance. I mean, people were asking me the odds, and I went from 10 to 1 down to 4 to 1, 3 to 1, 2 to 1, 20 to 1. You know, it was never a sure thing. Senator Wachowski definitely took the lead. Appreciated all of his efforts, because his district is one of the least served in the state. And I think he understands the introduction of technology and convenience for the consumers is going to have a greater benefit for the circular economy moving forward.
So what you're kind of describing to me is sort of an overused metaphor of the David and Goliath story. And I think it's overused because if you look at the story carefully, you realize that David had all the advantages. He had speed and he had smarts. But in the metaphor, the redemption centers are David and everybody else is Goliath. So how do we get smarter and faster next year?
I'll come back. I think it's going to have to come from the administration. You know, they're going to have to break the tie which direction they want to go.
Why would they want to do that? Why don't they just leave? Why won't they just leave it alone? If it's not a problem, let's not worry about it.
They could. They could. Because there's not a loud enough voice from the consumers, and it doesn't appear that there's any legal recourse for the consumers to challenge the lack of convenience in the program. Because Cal Recycle, they're just an administrator.
Right.
They're an enforcement arm. They're not actually running the program like a system operator would.
Right. In one of our early talks on this, Richard Valle said that there was some movement afoot in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office to try to find a legal hook to benefit consumers. Did anything come of that? Do you know?
I don't think anything came of it, because I think they probably did a little bit of homework and they realized you just can't sue the state when they're just in an administrative role. They're not required to provide the service.
Well, I don't want to get too much in the legal stuff. I've looked at it myself, and the problem I keep running into is you sort of have to prove at some level that you as consumer didn't put your bottle in the curbside bin. Otherwise, you lost a nickel yourself. And I haven't figured out a way around that yet.
Yeah, because I think there's 600 curbside programs.
Right.
And they all provide excellent service, a great opportunity to recycle some material. And when people put their containers in the curbside bin, the haulers get paid for the material that's in there, and that will help offset the collection costs. So there's a strong argument that that's a benefit to the consumers.
So as you sit here right now, looking ahead to next legislative season, what do you see yourself getting behind?
I would like to see a major overhaul. Either give Cal Recycle the authority to make changes. Somebody needs to run the program, because there's some things that make sense that need to continue to happen. There's other things that don't make sense that need to be changed. But the problem is when there's a few very, very strong stakeholders, if it affects them, they'll push back and then nothing gets done. So I like the thought of changing the program, turning it over to a system operator. I'm not sure that the Oregon program would be good for California. Other programs that are out there, whether it's Michigan, British Columbia, not sure they would work in California. Something that provides a complete major overhaul and lets a third-party organization run the program. Because I'm confident that the stakeholders, the beverage manufacturers and the grocers would be willing to pay a little bit more, provided they're getting quality service. It seems that in Oregon, they're very happy with the service because there's great convenience. Consumers enjoy the program. Within the program, Cal Recycle needs some additional funding for enforcement, because I'm one of the few people that think that there might be enough money in the program without changing what the producers have to pay, because there's probably an underreporting of 100 to 200 million of material that's being sold that's not paying into the program, and that's strictly an enforcement issue for Cal Recycle. They don't have the staff to do the audits that they need to of the dealers, the distributors, or the beverage manufacturers. The haulers need to be paid in the program for containers that are clean quality material. But I think in 2020, the number will come out where the curbside programs in the cities have gotten about 200 million out of the program for handling 10 to 12% of the material. I think the haulers need to be paid, but I don't think that much. There's a quality issue where they've been getting paid for contamination, somewhere along the lines of 10 to 20 million a year, just for garbage that's in their aluminum cans, PET plastic, and glass. Then there's a fraud component. Talking with some of the SoCal operators, they think that fraud in Southern California with recycling centers could be anywhere from 10 to 20% of the activity that's going on down there. Because there's some counties that are reporting redemption rates of close to 90%, which just seems very unrealistic. So I think there could be enough money, but it comes down to enforcement. And Cal Recycle doesn't have the staff or the budget to do it. But if it was a privately run organization, I think they would zero in pretty quickly on areas that they would have questions with. They would definitely protect the revenue side to make sure that all containers sold are paying into the program. And then if there is any fraud with recycling centers, they would address it quickly.
Well,
A question?
I would be personally interested to hear more about other programs in other states that you think might serve as a better model for California. But I think with this audience and this moment in time, we probably shouldn't do that. I think I would probably want to invite you back, but in January, or maybe even before, so we can talk about what could be teed up for this upcoming session and what would need to happen to get it more support. But I think for tonight, I'm just going to thank you for coming and sharing that with you. I'd like to turn it over to questions for others before we proceed on to our Recycling Archive segment. So thanks, Jeff.
And I enjoyed this group. I think you guys have a voice. Happy to participate in your meetings, but for the next meeting, I would definitely phone a friend and make sure that Susan Collins participated, because she's definitely a California treasure that has a much greater knowledge on a national and international level on systems that actually work.
What's the chance of the governor appointing her to be director of Cal Recycle? Or her taking it?
Good idea, John.
You know, the director of Cal Recycle is such a huge position. They have solid waste, they have disaster cleanup, and then this thing called the bottle bill. The bottle bill unto itself is a huge task. For somebody to have everything that's under the umbrella of Cal Recycle, it's almost too big of a job.
Split it up.
Yeah.
Anybody have questions of Jeff?
Yeah.
I've got a question. Go ahead, Dan. I'll follow you. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just thinking about a system operator, and I was thinking about a smaller model that I'm more familiar with, which is Berkeley. You know, we have what we like to call sometimes, or I do anyway, an ecology of commerce here, where we have at least 6 and maybe more material recovery enterprises. That's a category now that's in the zoning law, because I helped write it, for one thing. And so we have these material recovery enterprises, 3 of which are owned by the city, and 3 of which are private. 2 of the privates are nonprofits, and 1 is for-profit. That's Urban Ore. So we together all run the City of Berkeley transfer station, and who runs us and who manages the whole thing and is the system operator is, right now anyway, the Public Works Department. And they have changed over the years. They've been an opponent many times. We've had to fight with them tooth and nail. And other times they've been really wonderful. And right now we're in a kind of a peaceful position with them, and we're getting along well. but that doesn't mean it's optimal. I have for a long time said that I think that what we ought to be having as a system operator is some amalgam maybe of public works and economic development. Because really what we're talking about here is economic development. We're talking about resource trading. We're talking about refined resources. It's kind of like running something, when you run it like a utility, which is what public works does, you don't have the sensitivity to the small business aspect of it, where you find the quality considerations that really make a difference when you're selling stuff. You know, it's all about quality when you're in the reuse business. It's all about categories too, and subcategories. And what we find when you get into the waste business is that they want to make it real simple. And so instead of having we recognize 240 categories of reusable goods, that causes headaches to people that like to think about things as waste. They just want to have one category called waste, and then you get all the money from that. So, you know, coming back to the system operator, something having to do with economic development seems to me to be a way to go that would really make sense and still have a government oversight. I'm not so fond of the idea of turning it over to a private entity, because then you end up with things like what you've got in British Columbia, which is a monopoly that just screws the operators really badly in many, many ways. And I know this because my wife is on the board of directors of the British Columbia Bottle Depot Association, and she hears their complaints all the time. And I've also been, you know, dealing with people like Gerry Gillespie and Warren Snow, who complain that in those systems where they are, if you have a business that starts making money trading resources, all of a sudden the government steps in and says, oh, that stuff all belongs to us. Let us put it out to what they call tender, which means your business goes up on the chopping block, and they give it to somebody else, like a waste company. And so, you know, that ends up being an unintended consequence of too much private enterprise in charge of everything.
Dan, did you have a question for Jeff? I'm trying to keep the question.
Really, it's just back to the question of system operator and economic development, I guess, is what I'm really getting at. Do you think that has any merit at all, Jeff?
I think a system operator that runs the program outside of the legislature could be beneficial. Somebody that has the ability to work with the beverage manufacturers and the grocers to provide the services and run it like a business instead of like a state program that it is.
Yeah, well, that's okay, fine. That's basically the story of what's going on in Berkeley. All those material recovery enterprises, 3 of which are owned by the city of Berkeley, by the way, run like businesses.
Yeah.
Well, you're also talking about material recovery businesses where they're in the state, they're in competition with the waste industry.
That's right. And we are too.
Right. So they're from the waste industry point of view, their economic model's working. So I just, you know, it's not quite the same as Berkeley to me. I'm sorry, Doug, did you have a question?
Yeah, Jeff, when you sent us the email about the budget trailer bill for recycling centers, about a week and a half ago now, you know, I became very optimistic that I think this is something that might, you know, in the last 11th hour that might work. I didn't read the full 16 pages of the language of the trailer bill, but the letter that was sent to Governor Newsom, the commissioners yourself, and the commissioner's staff, that 3-page letter really seemed to have the essence of what would be the backbone of a good bottle bill template or format. So is that perhaps could serve as a template for 2022 next year to start off with a fresh, you know, all the things that, you know, the redemption centers being revitalized and so forth? Could that serve as kind of a model for crafting a new bottle bill?
Yeah, I think, you know, in the next 2 months, there's going to be some discussions. We'll find out what tomorrow brings, and hopefully it brings some consistency where we're all confident that there's an opportunity to do something next year. If there's a change in the administration, I don't think anything related to the bottle bill will happen next year. I think the items in the letter from the commission are still valid. I would like to thank your organization for submitting a letter. It was very helpful and encouraging for someone like me that had spent some time on it. So I think in the next 2 months, there's going to be some discussions between Senator Wajkowski's office, Assemblymember Bloom's office, just to see if there's any common ground. Senator Dodd may have another bill coming up that I think one of the major stakeholders is also involved in crafting, and that's an EPR program as well. And it might include wine and spirits. So I think we got to get through today, see what tomorrow brings, and then see what kind of discussions we can have for activity in 2022. Again, if there's consistency tomorrow, I think there's an opportunity. If there's a change, I think bottle bill's way down the list. It remains number 49 of 50 on everybody's list.
Any other questions for Jeff? Hearing none. Thank you, Jeff, again for joining us. Please, you're absolutely welcome to stay, but we're going to proceed along to our next phase of our meeting, which is each month we highlight a recycling pioneer. Think of it as baseball cards of recycling people. This month's card is Gerry Gillespie, and Susan Kinsella is going to introduce Gerry and the topic. Susan?
Okay. I should probably start with just a little bit of a description of the recycling archives, where we've been interviewing people that have been innovating in the recycling system since, for decades, since some of the early versions of the systems that we have now. And we want to make sure that all that history is gathered and that people know it, because we're finding there are a lot of lessons from the early years that could be very helpful to us now as we look at how to create a better system in these years. So tonight, I want to talk about Gerry Gillespie and Carolyn Brooks from Australia. I'm going to be reading from an interview that both of them spoke on. Gerry and Carolyn were pioneers in pushing for and promoting a great deal of the recycling system in Australia. Early on, Gerry developed innovative ways to advance organics recycling through composting with worms. And I think, Bonnie, you're going to show some of the posters that we have that Carolyn designed, right? Then Gerry also began advancing recycling programs, and often against abysmal obstacles. Ultimately, his work towards Australia's goal of no waste by 2010 became the inspiration for our zero waste goals and campaigns here in the US. Carolyn created wonderful newsletters and fact sheets and posters and communications, some of which, like the ones that we're going to be showing you here, we're going to be showing you a number of them while I'm reading from Gerry's interview. So Bonnie, I want to see if we can get some of those posters up.
Yeah, certainly. Sorry, I was having connectivity issues, but yeah, if John can make me host.
You keep getting knocked off, but I'm doing it again right now.
Yeah, I changed
Okay.
Wi-Fi's at this point. Okay, great. 1 second. I'm going to share my screen.
Okay, so you need to go back up to the first one. Okay. And then as we go through, oops, I'm losing some of this. Back to meeting. then Bonnie will change some of the posters as well.
All right, so you moved some of the images around in the presentation, is that it?
Well, it starts at the top of the PowerPoint and then they go in order through the script that you got there.
Yes, I have that ready.
Okay, cool. I keep getting thrown out of the Zoom thing here. Okay, so I'm going to start with some of what Gerry said in his interview. So I'm reading from the interview now. Starting in the very early 1990s, we set up a group called the Southeast Region Recycling Group in the area surrounding Canberra, our national capital city. The overall name of the national capital area is the Australian Capital Territory, or ACT. And for those who are saying, well, what's ACT? This is similar to the US District of Columbia, or DC, where our US Washington, DC is cited. So Gerry goes on. Within this Australian Capital Territory were 17 councils, local governments that were charged with public works and other local community services. And these 17 councils had been reluctant to do anything about recycling because landfilling was the accepted and quote unquote normal activity. On the ground, landfilling was managed by local health and building inspectors. And these inspectors thought they had resolved the issue of waste management by requiring operators to speedily bury everything that came through the gate. Then we came along and wanted to recycle everything. We were trying to get the local governments more involved in recycling programs. The engineers and most of the health and building inspectors were contented with landfilling. It seemed stupid to them to double the work they'd have to do. They thought we were fools who wanted to start pulling all of this stuff out of the ground and selling it. We were interfering with the way local government operated at the time. Trouble was ahead. We also had to challenge lies about recycling put out by Rupert Murdoch's press and business outlets. He owned newspapers that were producing stories that created big swings up and down in the prices for collected recyclable paper, because he also owned paper mills that did not want to have to switch to making recycled paper. Newspaper stories could influence whether paper collected for recycling got sent to recycled paper manufacturers or instead got wasted by dumping it into landfills. Dumping it also discouraged citizens' recycling participation and encouraged local governments to restrict recycling, even though that paper was desperately needed for recycled paper production. People were constantly lied to about the reliability of recycling. To get around that, we produced a truthful magazine that went to households at no cost to local governments. Early on, I was asked if I'd like to run a recycling education program for a suburb of Canberra, and we began by running a whole series of recycling collection trials using different types of bins, crates, bags, and boxes. It was so complex, we ended up color coding the entire system so we could evaluate all the different possibilities. Unfortunately, the success of the whole thing was measured more on time efficiency rather than quality. The question was how quickly it got collected, not quality of product that got sent to manufacturers. That cemented the side loader one driver system in place, otherwise known at the time as single stream. When you picked up recyclables mixed up in a single bin, they were dumped all together into the back of a truck with a hard steel bed. That broke a lot of glass and mixed it with paper. This gave bad results if the company doing collection had one contract and the one running the materials recovery facility that sorted the materials had a different contract. Following the guidance that time efficiency was so important, the company doing the collections wanted to save themselves money. Rather than going around and then back to the factory to drop off a load, they increased the compaction on the recyclables. So they would push all the glass and the plastic and stuff in together and just make a mess of it. That's where the idiocy of single stream side loader vehicles became clear to me. No matter how good, grand, and efficient the single stream collection was, the quality of the product was always poor. For many years, Chinese manufacturing businesses were our main market for these recyclables. The Chinese government ended up rejecting.
You muted yourself, Susan.
Okay. Am I back?
Yes.
And where do I need to go back to?
About a 2 sentences, maybe 3.
All right, I'll go back to the, for many years, Chinese manufacturing businesses were our main market for these recyclables. The Chinese government ended up rejecting containers and paper that we sent to them for recycling. There was so much glass in the plastic, and plastic in the paper, and paper in the plastic, and food and everything. We were sending garbage to the Chinese markets and expecting them to sort it out. We were happy to do that, while ignoring the fact that our choice of collection technology was restricting what they could recycle, even with hand labor. Once they got set up and were more organized, the Chinese government started threatening Western societies that unless the material we were exporting got much cleaner, they would close their ports to our exported garbage. And ultimately, that's what they did. Unfortunately, we still haven't changed our systems. In New South Wales, just a few years after that material was rejected by China, our government responded by putting another $47 million into side loader vehicle recycling, which had already proven that it was failing. That made everything even worse. So here, Carolyn adds some additional perspective from her experience as the graphics and communications expert for the Australian Capital Territories recycling programs, describing some problems that are pretty familiar to us in our US recycling programs too. Carolyn says, it was disappointing for me after putting in so much effort to come up with branding and strong messages to see that there was not the commitment at the top levels of the government to see it through and to understand that waste could be a resource. I remember when I suggested a poster with the theme, trash is really treasure, only to be told by the government person, what? We don't want anyone to think that somebody is making money out of recycling. That was a shock. Another disappointment for me was the lost opportunity right at the beginning of the 90s to come up with a national color coding scheme for bins. A lack of consistency became very confusing for people moving from state to state, where often the schools had different colored bins from the ones in ACT. People were confused when they didn't need to be. And now Gerry continues. While this single stream scenario was playing out, we started looking at a community consultation for a new waste strategy into the future. I think it's pretty well recognized around the world that no waste by 2010 was the world's first. By 2001, the ACT discard management system we invented was diverting more than 70% of domestic waste from landfill. The community consultation for the no waste by 2010 strategy ran for about 18 months, and then it became government policy on the 19th of December, 1996. But a new government, a lot like the USA's neoconservatives, took over in Canberra and started abandoning the no waste goal by building a huge extension to the existing landfill. That was unfortunate because the no waste goal we created had been taken to extraordinary heights in different parts of the world. Zero waste is now the most common theme for anybody managing recycling programs. And then at this point, Dan Knapp takes over the story by explaining, in 1995, 1 year before no waste was passed by the ACT government, Gerry Gillespie and I met one another for the first time in Canberra and spent 2 days in discussions. Various governments in Australia had paid me to come to Sydney, Canberra, and Melbourne and talk about my already published theory of total recycling, based on my observations made while working as a scavenger at the City of Berkeley landfill. The heart of the total recycling theory was 12 markets categories, which if recovered fully would create a no waste or zero waste outcome. And I believe, I can't see it right now, but I believe on the screen is a poster that Nancy Gorell, an artist and illustrator here in Berkeley, created to illustrate Dan's total recycling concept. Dan brought the news about Australia's no waste by 2010 goal back to the US and started stirring up excitement and enthusiasm about it all over the country, where the name soon changed to Zero Waste. So Gerry picks up the story again and he continues. When I first went to America in 1997, the purpose of my trip was to attend the first ever really big zero waste event, which was held in Monterey, California. The venue was a California Resource Recovery Association, CRRA conference with record attendance. Close to 1,000 people showed up. There were many, many influential recyclers who were mingling and meeting. I'd been assigned to manage the community engagement, which ultimately got the Australian Capital Territory to pass its no waste by 2010 goal, and that success made me a bit of a celebrity overseas. I do remember meeting Jerry Brown, who was California's governor for the second time. I met quite a few people that I got to know much better later, and it was quite a successful event in many ways, large and small. So, for me, what I want to say is, as we all know now, zero waste became the Americanized version of Australia's no waste by 2010 goal, which has sparked the spread of zero waste goals all over the USA, as well as in many other nations around the world. Dan and Jerry's meeting in 1995 in Australia, and Jerry's attending the 1997 CRRA conference in Monterey, were historic in inspiring new aggressive recycling goals in the US, and that history is not yet finished. It continues as we get closer and closer to achieving those zero waste goals. Become a recycling warrior.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
So we're lucky tonight to have Jerry with us, the architect of no waste. And I'm going to do a terrible lawyer thing and ask a compound question. It looked like what you did in Canberra or had to overcome in Canberra seems a lot alike the problems that you were hearing about a little while ago with our bottle bill. Somehow you reached the highest level of government at the time and caused them to make changes. And it also looked like you used a lot of multimedia, probably pretty effectively. So having said all that, what do you recommend to us for trying to get back to the ideal that you created? Especially as far as the bottle bill goes.
I think there's a few things that, can you hear me, John?
Yes.
I think there are a few things. One of the really distinct advantages we had in Canberra and the Australian Capital Territory is that people in the main are highly educated, reasonably well off. It's one of the more difficult places to be poor in Australia. But having said that, the awareness that people have of things in regard to the environment, I think is the principal thing probably that drove the No Waste by 2010 strategy. The idea came up in a community consultation. It was simply a woman who said to me during conversation or during a questions period like this, if we're making all this waste, isn't it possible to have absolutely no waste? And I said, well, it's obviously logical. Yes, you can. And so once that term, she said, well, why can't we have no waste by 2010? She had brought to that meeting a document by the Council of Newcastle in New South Wales, Australia, and they had gone through a community consultation process where this outline of no waste by 2010 was put forward as a suggestion. It had no chance of surviving in that local government area. I think it only lasted one iteration, but once it was in the text of the document for the ACT, it had to be in there really. If for us to say that we'd done the community consultation and we did a series of aggregations where we took the most dominant theme from those things, and that thing kept floating to the top. In relation to your bottle bill, I have a sort of a bit of a mixed history with container deposit legislation here in Australia. Excuse me, I'm just going to have I'm still under a treatment for cancer, so I'm running out of moisture all the time. One of the really difficult things, and I think it comes back to some of the points that Jeff was making in his previous presentation. One of the really difficult things that happened here when we started to do consultation about container deposits, it was sort of a discussion about everything and about how that money could then go to groups, as they did in South Australia with container deposits. The places where the bottles and other containers were dropped off became recycling centres, and they built the base for the community. But what eventually happened in New South Wales, once it got into the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy was running everything, everybody tends to forget that bureaucrats in the main have never run a business. They've got no idea about profit and loss. Somebody puts your pay into your bank account every week or hands you a check or whatever. But you don't have any idea about the costs and benefits of raising money in a private sector or a non-private sector business. The thing that we ended up with in New South Wales is a container deposit system. It only takes, I think, about probably 4 or 5 different types of plastic bottle and probably half a dozen different types of glass bottle. There are no wine bottles in it. There are no whiskey bottles in it. There are no jam jars, no tomato ketchup bottles. All of those sorts of things just don't go into the system. And then on top of that, to add injustice to the design of the system, they gave the entire bloody thing to one of probably the second largest waste company in Australia. And the only other people who make money out of it are the people who designed the bottle scanner, which is a company from bloody Sweden. So you've got these things dotted all around New South Wales that are basically operated by a really big waste company who are already making a fortune out of the existing contract mayhem that they've got, and a Swedish company for the benefit of a small length of conveyor belt and a bottle scanner. So in terms of the community, I think it's been an absolute bloody disaster. It cut into what was already being recycled, but then again, we had the problem of single side loader vehicle recycling. And I'm almost ashamed to say that I was actually involved in a lot of the design of that stuff originally. But it has been horrific. When you look at Wales in the United Kingdom, people have a stacked. I've got a book that we released last year called "The Waste Between Our Ears," your ears, the waste between our ears. But it's in that model. There's those pictures of the Wales model, which is a series of stacked crates, one on top of the other, which fit on a cart. And the whole cart, once you've sorted out all your stuff into its different categories, goes out to the curbside. And when the truck turns up, it's run by 2 or 3 people, the truck, and they gently place everything into its different categories. So all of the money, instead of going into side loader vehicles that are worth $500,000 each, all of the money goes into local jobs, local employment, and people, organisations who have their rounds of collection. But even saying that, and I'm sorry, John, this is a really elaborate answer to your question. I think it's really important that whatever happens to that money, whatever happens to that decision for container deposit legislation or anything to do with this sector, the money's got to end up in the community, either as a private sector organisation like Urban or as a not-for-profit that's actually distributing those resources more equitably through the community. If you give it to a big waste company, all they'll do is, they're making a fortune anyway. They're making money out of, as I said, running one contract to compact everything, and then you're paying another company the same amount of money to pull all the bloody stuff apart again. You know, it's just an insanity. And then you get this problem where the stuff is so destroyed and so intermashed and intermixed that you can't sell it to anybody because nobody wants to buy somebody else's mixed waste. In this country particularly, and I'll stop after this, John, in this country particularly, the biggest single issue we have is organic material. We have a huge big river system that runs from Queensland through New South Wales into Victoria, right down to South Australia. The water for that river system produces 40 to 45% of our total agricultural production. We're losing nearly $1 billion worth of soil every year in that system due to the overuse of chemicals and the disconnect between the urban centres and the farmers. We need to put every single bit of organic material we've got needs to go back into the soil as a source separated, clean product that's either composted or turned into a foliar fertiliser that actually gets back into lifting microbial levels. So again, the power of any of these sorts of changes has to end up back in the community. If it's just left to a waste company, they'll cut the bloody corners off things and modify it so that they maximize their money without necessarily overly committing to general distribution of the resources in the community. I'm sorry, John, that went on a bit.
No, that was great. Thank you, Gerry. You know, I asked you a difficult question about a very difficult subject, and you gave a very great answer that was succinct. It has to be, you have to benefit the community. I think that's the lesson.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to others for questions. Neil, you have your hand up.
Neil?
Neil.
Oh, I forgot. First and foremost, it's absolutely wonderful to see you, Gerry, and continued good health.
Thank you, Neil. Can I just mention a little bit of history?
Sure.
When we went to that first conference in Monterey,
Yep.
Neil and I shared a hotel room. That was the first time we met.
It was the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Yes, lovely
from
to see you again.
from 14,000 miles away. Well, first of all, a quick fact. Thank you for describing the whale system. We have two lone representatives of that system. We call it Curbside here. One is in a rural area, Central County, Pennsylvania, and the other is in a big city, Fayetteville, Arkansas, where they have Curbside and have had it for years. Every few years, they try to get rid of it and put in single stream, but those good old citizens keep saving it. So just share that information. There's so much more to talk about. Comment on what you said. I want to stick to one thing. The emergency from the very beginning of your talk. I'm hopeful that two things are combining. One, the media savvy term zero waste. I think the work itself is fantastic, but the phrasing we have is so much in our favor, as many of us have used in our work. I think that helps us because it's pretty simple. And the second thing is that the environmental crises that availed us in the 60s, a river on fire, the Santa Barbara oil spill, etc., those were nothing compared to what we're facing now. So my hope is that the building tragedy of the earth being destroyed in front of us on TV, combined with the simplicity of the solution, zero waste, no waste, is in our favor. So that's my comment to your wonderful introduction to this discussion.
Did you have a question also, or just a comment?
No, I just wanted to make a comment. Thank you.
Okay.
If I could add to a little too, John, I think one of the wonderful things that's happening, apart from the Zero Waste International Alliance, has still been running very competently, mainly in your area around with, well, a number of people. But one of the really great successes that's really taken off has been Zero Waste Europe. I think they must have close to 400 communities now who are actually committed to zero waste. But as Neil says, it is really, really taking off as a concept. And I think it is unstoppable. But from our perspective here, we've got a great deal to learn. But I think, you know, the organics is going to be the key to it here in Australia.
So speaking of that, I have said privately to certain people that what zero waste in this country needs is a Greta Thunberg. Are there any Greta Thunbergs in the zero waste community in Europe or in Australia?
I think there are some very good people. Neil might be more familiar with them than I.
I don't know. Well, I know a few excellent people in Europe with Zero Waste Europe, who are, by the way, now on the board of Zero Waste International Alliance. But I was going to say that I think we have hundreds, if not thousands, of Greta. The only difference is we're not as young as she is, but we've got a lot of young people coming up. So I'm very confident that
Zero Waste.
I'm not confident that we'll win. Who knows if we're going to win? But I think we have plenty of people to articulate our cause.
Well, get them to
I
join
think
NICRA.
one of the things about the Zero Waste Europe group is almost everybody is under 50 that I'm aware of. Jean-Marc Simon, who's been the chair since its first days, I think is still only in his 40s, but most of the people are quite young, so that is a huge benefit. that
Yes.
they actually see it and they're moving it.
Anybody else have questions of Gerry? Dan?
Yes. Jerry, you're married to Carolyn Brooks.
Yes.
We've seen some of her graphics. You two are partners in many, many different ways. I wonder if you could comment on the yin and the yang of being an activist in material recovery and having a relationship like you have with your wife.
It's been very interesting, both mainly from the perspective of both of us. I'm sorry, hello, Mary Lou.
Hi, Jerry.
From the perspective that both of us have been working with words for a long, long time. Graphic designers are incredibly, they have a remarkable ability to condense things to the most simplistic form. So when you're trying to get a message out, it's got to be clever and it's got to be attractive and it's got to be succinct. And Carolyn brings all of those things to the conversation. That book that I mentioned previously, The Waste Between Our Ears, is something Carolyn's read that through probably 5 times now. So we've proofread it together and with other people coming in and out. So everything we do, everything we've ever done, working in partnership on things, even with the government, there's always been that relationship where you're actually proofreading each other's work and condensing each other's work. The graphic design too is one of those lovely things where they're almost that same sort of magic that theatre directors have, where you pull the words and the scenes almost from the atmosphere and condense it all into something that appears on a stage. So it's that ability to condense things, I think, Dan, more than anything else, that's been the real joy of working with Carolyn.
Sounds like you're living with an artist.
Yes, yes, that's where she is now. Actually, we've got a little single car garage in this house that we're in. Just turned 100 last year, I think. We've got a little single car garage that we tiled and lined, and she uses that for a studio. One thing we did forget though is that we didn't know about when we bought the house. It was in the middle of the drought, and now whenever we get really, really heavy rain, she has a creek running through her studio. So
Oh, no.
we had to put a bilge pump on the high side and pump the water out before it gets to the boat. But anyway, it makes artistic work even more entertaining for her.
How much, Jerry, how much did the artwork, do you think, helped convince the highest level of government to move forward? Was the artwork?
I think it's integral to the conversation. She started doing that sort of stuff for the ACT government too, at a point where graphic designers, and I mentioned that idea of after the R99 conference in Geneva, where we tried to form that international group. Computers weren't anywhere near as sophisticated when Carolyn started working with the government. That was in the very early 90s. So everything had to be drafted, and we were just going through some of her work after one of the recent floods in her studio, just trying to sort out some of the graphics that she had. And she had incredibly elaborate covers for magazines that had all been hand drawn, hand colored. You didn't have those things of just putting something together and whacking it on a screen. So you could always take to the client something that was a very emotive document, and you could put the emotion into it as you presented it to them as well. And I think that was always been integral to the way that essential to the way that she's worked.
Well, that's my experience in my business. You know, persuasion is all about storytelling. It's all about imagery. It's all about a picture tells 1,000 words.
Yes,
Another
that's
thing
very, very
Carolyn
true.
does is logos, company logos. One of the companies that she did a logo for was called Revolve, and it was a very similar organization to Urban Ore. And her logo for that was quite a beautiful thing.
Mhm.
We
Yes,
didn't show any of those logos, unfortunately, but she does those.
yes. I'll try to get one of those sent to you. Dan just mentioned Revolve, that both he and Mary Lou came out. It's a perfect example of government getting to a situation where a community group has made a business so successful, and then as soon as it got to the stage where it was worth $1.25 million a year and employed 32 people, they decided that it was worth too much money to have one group have it. So they had to put it out to the community to make sure that everybody got a fair chance at it. Then so they quite illegally and unlawfully, and it was a hideous thing. Mary Lou and Dan made a really quite a substantial donation to try to keep us going at one stage, but we just had no chance of winning in the finish. The courts, unfortunately, the Australian Capital Territory, Canberra, is a company town, so it's an administrative centre. The government runs everything. If you're a solicitor or you're a judge or you're a taxi driver, your main boss is the government. That's where the money comes from. You never try to upset the government unless you've got fairly good coverage in some other areas. So I'm not saying that the judiciary is that necessarily biased, but the business of Revolve, which was a registered company, an incorporated company with its own Australian business number. So it was recognised as a business. It had been paying taxes on that basis for many, many years. They actually didn't put when the lease was up, every landlord is entitled in this country to put their lease premises out to lease, but you can't lease a butcher shop out as a butcher shop. What they did though was they took the Revolve business and put it out for sale as a Revolve type business. They put the business out for sale, not the site, out for tender. So I'm sweating on the idea that we're going to get an independent commission of corruption when we get rid of this current corrupt government. And when we do, I'll be back in their front door of the first ICAC they come up with a description of what happened to Revolve, because it's an outrage that we keep getting done all around the world. This is happening. The whole of the community recycling network in the UK has been destroyed by this process.
You can tell we've become dangerous.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Go ahead, Susan.
Susan?
Well, as you're talking, Gerry, I'm thinking about, you were talking about we need to make sure that the citizens are benefited and the community is benefited. And we talk about that too within the archives, and lots of the interviews that we have been recording have referred to things like that. And I keep wondering, we're having arguments now in the US about, well, maybe we should just turn everything over to some big corporations to run it and they'll take care of it and everything. But there's no thought about the communities, about the local governments. And of course, the local governments are thinking, sure, give it away, then we don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
How do I think that the citizens will care if they truly lose it, but it'll be after the fact. And I'm just wondering what thoughts you might have or lessons you might have about how do you get the citizens to care enough to save it at this point?
I think Dan and Mary Lou made this point. So did various other people who visited from the US during that time that battle was going on, because you're so much more aware of sort of commercial outcomes. But what we unfortunately did was we were so busy trying to fight the government to keep the business in-house on the actual landfill. We should have done what Mary Lou and Dan did and moved the business away. We should have had the business centre moved somewhere off-site so that it was seen as an independent thing. But because it was all perceived as being part of this waste system, they just saw it as their own and just manipulate it as much as you like. I think community ownership not only involves allowing the community to share in how the organisation recycles, but also where the organisation recycles. I think it's important that they can go into a spot like Urban Ore and feel it's totally disconnected from any council or local government service.
So Gerry, one more question, Neil.
Sure. Thank you for that question, Susan. These are great questions. I would point out that in the US, as a generalization, the West Coast cities are doing much better than the East Coast cities, but the West Coast cities aren't doing anything that can't be done on the East Coast. And the difference is the citizenship, as Susan said. In Seattle, San Francisco, LA, the citizens are mobilized. In Baltimore, the citizens are mobilized, although they haven't gotten as far as those other cities I mentioned. But what I'm struck with is, as Gerry describes what went on in Australia, which is quite horrific, is that the struggles are different. Excuse me, the struggle is the same in different circumstances. So we're fighting EPR in this country, the takeover by these corporations, and we're also fighting single stream. But I find it fascinating in your description of what you're dealing with, how different it is, and how at the same time it's the same thing, same creature, the monopolies, grabbing, greed, etc. And finally, I think to answer Susan's question, rather to make a suggestion for Susan's question, not necessarily to answer it, is that we have to keep fighting to keep the scale of the technology appropriate. And we constantly have to mobilize people to make sure there's room for small businesses, nonprofits, co-ops. And that's the struggle against our system, both in Australia and the US. So it's wonderful hearing how universal the problems are and how each of us are trying to get it solved.
So I'm going to ask one more question because it got prompted. So Gerry, when I hear you talking about the need to involve community and make a resource recovery a community resource, in this country, the communities, meaning the cities and counties, they largely don't want that job. And mostly the reason they don't want it is because they don't want the legal responsibility for it. We might have a few too many lawyers in this country. And the problem was that is that all these lawyers are looking for somebody to sue over something. Counties don't want to be involved in anything that gets them sued. How is that different in Australia?
Currently, I don't think there is any difference. So it used to be unlawful for legal firms in Australia to tout for business, but now we have this constant television barrage of people saying, you know, if you've fallen over and hit your head or something, then come and see us and we'll get you compensation. It's interesting if you go to New Zealand. New Zealand, interestingly, a big Maori group in New Zealand have just applied to change the name of the country from New Zealand to Aotearoa. I hope they win.
Yes.
But if you fall over in New Zealand, so what? They decided some years ago there were 3.5 million people or 3 million people or whatever it was at the time. There was no way that they could afford to pay out all these money to people who fall over and hurt themselves. You fall over and hurt yourself, it's your fault. You know, you have to sort it out. So that's just the way New Zealand quirkily dealt with it. But in terms of that circumstance in Australia, I don't know, John. I don't know how you deal with that sort of factor where things just become so commercialized and litigious all the time. I think we're going to face more of that same sort of thing.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gerry. I'd love to continue the discussion. This is a committee. We have an open forum where people can come and bring their new ideas, and you're welcome to stay for that. But I need to segue into that. From the point of view of California, Australia is always the future. So thank you for joining us from the future.
Thank you, Gerry.
Thank you.
See you,
Jerry.
Gerry.
Great to see you again.
Good to see you. If you don't mind, I'll leave because I've got various other people I've got to talk to this morning.
Sure.
Anyway.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Carolyn.
Give Carolyn a big hug from all of us.
Yes.
Will do. And thank you very much. And lovely to meet you all. Or again. Bye-bye.
Yes.
See you soon. Bye.
So this is open forum from the Zero Waste Advocacy Committee. I think Arthur had wanted to mention a couple of things. Is there anybody else that wants to talk about something new? Hearing none, Arthur, why don't you sum up what you'd like us to do? Or not? Arthur?
Is he muted?
He was just there. Oh, there he is. Yeah, he's muted.
Arthur, you got 5 seconds to unmute. Well, is there anybody else that wants to bring up something new before we adjourn?
Yes, I have just a point of information. I'm on another line with Max Wexler, who is watching the Zoom City of Berkeley City Council meeting that's about to begin in 6 minutes. And on the consent calendar is an item to keep the Zero Waste Commission independent and by itself, because the city had a plan to merge the Zero Waste Commission with a couple or three other commissions. And they would manage 3 or 4 different areas of interest. One would be the Public Works Commission, another would be, I don't know what all.
Yeah, but they'd split everything
But
up
they'd
and
split everything.
balkanize everything. And so there wouldn't be this one organization dealing with discard management.
And the new
so,
proposed transfer station, which is now in development.
Yeah, the first thing I thought of when that happened was, oh my gosh, they are really letting themselves in for trouble, because these things can, how we handle our discards can get people very, very passionate. And when they do, and you don't have a forum for working those things out, like we have with the Zero Waste Commission, where we can go in there and argue these points and get these things resolved. When you don't have that, you have people then that get pretty irrational, and you get into some really, really difficult situations. And we've had a lot of that in Berkeley.
Yes.
And it's always disruptive. And so I just think that they are way, way better off to keep that commission going.
So I was unclear, Mary Lou, what's on the consent calendar is an item that would not do all that or would do all that?
That would keep the Zero Waste Commission separate from all this merger and acquisition
Yeah,
stuff.
the person who carried it is Chris DeTorne, who's the current chair of the Zero Waste Commission.
Yeah.
Okay.
So city council is, unless it gets pulled from consent, city council will keep the Zero Waste Commission separate from all this other stuff.
Okay.
Yep, the downside would be if they pull it, somebody pulls it, then they have to discuss it, but it still would probably be voted on. And if it's voted on, I would imagine that it would probably pass. But that's the question really, is whether it's going to get pulled or not.
Okay.
So Max is representing us in that meeting.
Go Max.
Yeah.
Anybody else have anything new to report before I adjourn the meeting? Hearing nothing. Next month on the ZWAC Show, we're going to be going back to the earth. The subject matter will be the soil and how to conserve it. Some of the things we've been talking about in previous months. So please join us in October for the ZWAC Show. And thank you for joining us tonight. And I will adjourn.